I call Louisa Wall.
Tēnā koe te māngai o te whare, tēnā koutou katoa. It is my pleasure to speak at this third reading of the Misuse of Drugs Medicinal Cannabis Amendment Bill, and I do so as the Chair of the Health Select Committee, and I want to acknowledge my Deputy Chair, Dr Shane Reti, and the other members of the committee. I also would like to take the opportunity to congratulate Minister Clark and also our New Zealand First colleagues, particularly Jenny Marcroft, and our Greens colleagues, and particularly Chloe Swarbrick. I think that the work that the three of us, in terms of our coalition government and our support partners, have undertaken, given this bill was first read on the 20th of December 2018, to actually bring a bill before this Parliament in less than a year is incredibly well done, should I say, well done. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the officials from the Ministry of Health and also the police and also our Parliamentary Council office. They served us incredibly well, and I want to take the opportunity to acknowledge that work. So the Health Select Committee actually worked incredibly hard on this piece of legislation. And in fact, all up, there were 7 amendments that we actually considered, and 5 of which ended up being included in the Minister's supplementary order paper that we discussed at the committee stage of this bill. And so I do want to acknowledge colleagues from across the House for their constructive engagement in that process. We wouldn't have actually come up with those amendments unless we'd put the effort into actually trying to make this bill the best bill that it could be. And I do need to highlight that this was part of the government's 100-day commitment. And essentially it was about improving access to medicinal cannabis. And so one of the things I want to put on record is that actually medicinal cannabis was available before this piece of legislation was brought to the House. But the big issue actually was about what products were available. And there is a product called Sativex, and it can cost up to $1,200 a month for people who need it. So the issue that we were trying to address actually was one of supply, and this bill very much was about fairness. So was it fair for people who needed medicinal cannabis to have to pay $1,200 a month? Obviously no, and so from our perspective, the other part of that process was creating a quality product that was also safe, and we proposed to do that through the development of a medicinal cannabis scheme. Now, we've chosen to do that through the scheme, not as an act of Parliament but via regulation. And so what I want to highlight is that regulations are not actions of the House. And so, in fact, the process that the Minister has outlined is incredibly important because what that will enable is through the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Committee, for example, that will be created under this piece of legislation, which will include health professionals, manufacturers, suppliers, medicinal cannabis users, and actually from our submission and consultation process, Māori, who specifically wanted to be included in that group, and also the disability sector. And I do have to highlight is that actually philosophically that is the big difference between the proposition from the Minister, is that we're going to create a medicinal cannabis scheme via regulation, as opposed to the opposition. And I do want to acknowledge Dr Shane Reti, who has proposed what would have been a piece of legislation that would have had all the components that we believe actually the public should have the ability to comment on. And I do say to Dr Reti, given all that work that you've done, please make a submission. And I'm being genuine to that end, because I know that the work you have done has been incredibly valuable and it can actually assist us as we move forward. The other issue I wanted to highlight was that this bill was also about compassion. And when we talk about compassion, it was a recognition that there are many people using cannabis for medicinal purposes that actually don't have access to it. Because, as I said before, we have one product and it's $1,200 a month. So we did have 1,786 written submissions. Of those, we heard from 158 oral submitters. But I guess the most telling part in terms of the debate about who should be exempt from prosecution, and the fact that the original proposition in this bill was that it should be people who are terminally ill with less than 12 months to live. What we found from the 584 submitters who specifically wanted to talk about this exception and statutory defence provision, 174 of those submitters came to the committee because they were suffering from debilitating and chronic pain. We had 22 submitters who either experienced cancer or their loved ones did. We had 16 submitters who had epilepsy. There were 17 submitters who experienced multiple sclerosis. And there were also 74 submitters that actually said anybody should be able to have access or be exempt from prosecution if their doctor said that using medicinal cannabis was actually going to assist. And so that discussion about who should be exempt from prosecution until we have quality, safe, cheap, affordable product available did consume a lot of the time of the committee. And I just want to highlight for people who are unsure of what we're talking about, if you've got a malignant condition, it's mostly people who suffer from types of cancers. If it's non-malignant, we're actually talking about people who suffer from motor neuron disease. Now, 95% of people diagnosed will die within 2 to 5 years. And so we're talking about people who have motor neuron disease, people who have Parkinson's disease, people who have multiple sclerosis, people who have COPD. And so the reality of this particular piece of legislation to members of our community, who we found out through the process are incredibly vulnerable, is something that I absolutely want to highlight, because these are the people who shared their stories, either their personal stories or they were there advocating on behalf of their loved ones. So can I say from a select committee perspective, thank you for your generosity, thank you for being so vulnerable, and I hope what you've seen actually is a response by the committee to your voices, I know that there were others that thought it should be a bit more broad, but I actually think that the exemption that can be provided by medical practitioners, doctors, nurse practitioners, actually provide scope for people who do have chronic conditions to fit if it is within a palliative regime. I'd also like to highlight that the research about why medicinal cannabis is so important has started to come to the fore, and particularly I want to point to a piece of research from the European Journal of International Medicine that essentially, which was released in May this year, which essentially said that medicinal cannabis for people who are suffering actually alleviates pain. And the alleviation of that pain means that people actually have gone from a pain scale between 8 and 10 for almost half of those in the study to after 6 months, only 5% of those people suffering that excruciating pain. It also means people can sleep, and it also means that people can eat. I think the last point that I want to make, and it has been really underplayed from the beginning, but it's actually the economic opportunities that this whole medicinal cannabis scheme actually is going to create. And I want to acknowledge Manukedi and Hikurangi Cannabis Company and the whānau in Ruatoria, because actually with Minister Jones in the House, I think that there are going to be economic development opportunities for the regions. And so the global market, it was valued at $8.28 billion US in 2017. The projections are that by 2024, this industry is going to be worth $28 billion US dollars. And so I want to acknowledge that the reason that the industry is going to grow so much is because there has been an increased acknowledgement of the benefits of medicinal cannabis.
Yes, I would like
also,
to remember to come back to the bill, please. This was actually not a wide debate.
So the bill will also enable cannabis cultivation licences to be issued for research purposes, and going back to my highlighting Hikurangi Cannabis Company, they've received one, Madam Speaker. And so I commend the bill to the House, and can I just say that as a process, this is the first bill that our committee has seen through to fruition, And I just again want to thank my colleagues for the way that we conduct ourselves in the committee. And at the end of the day, we're here to serve the people of New Zealand. Kia ora.
Madam Chair.
I call the Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Madam Chair, I'd also like to acknowledge the Chair of the Health Select Committee,